The most controversial answer to the Dyatlov Pass mystery may also be the least theatrical. Not a murderer in the dark, not a secret intruder crossing the snow, but weather, timing, and a slope the hikers themselves altered. In the official record, the tent was not found torn open by an enemy outside. It was cut from the inside. The tracks did not show a chase or a fight. They led away from shelter, down into lethal cold. Investigators recorded no signs of struggle in or near the tent, and no traces of other people. That is the contradiction at the center of the archive. 9 trained Soviet ski hikers left their shelter on the eastern slope of height 1079, Kholat Syakhl, around the night of February 1st to 2nd, 1959. They left behind the objects that should have kept them alive: shoes, outer clothing, equipment, food, blankets, backpacks, storm jackets, trousers, personal belongings, and diaries. They went into winter conditions severe enough that exposure alone could kill. Some were later found with injuries that looked, at first glance, too violent for a simple night in the snow. The case has refused to stay closed, because each piece of evidence seems to pull against another. A tent cut from within suggests urgency, but not who or what created it. Footprints leading downhill suggest order, or at least movement without the visible chaos of a fight, but not why people would leave warmth and supplies behind. The absence of other tracks narrows the field, but it does not calm the imagination. Exposure deaths make sense in -25 to -30 degrees Celsius with strong wind, but severe traumatic injuries complicate the picture. An avalanche review may explain danger on the slope, but for decades, many people objected that the tent had not been found buried in the simple way they expected from an avalanche disaster. So the question here is restrained on purpose. Can a weather-driven slab avalanche, small, delayed, and shaped by the local terrain, account for the known record without inventing an attacker? The archive begins with the result. 10 members of a Ural Polytechnic Institute ski trekking party set out in late January of 1959 for a difficult winter route through the northern Urals. 1. Yuri Yudin turned back because illness prevented him from continuing. The remaining 9 were Igor Dyatlov, Lyudmila Dubinina, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Alexander Kolevatov, Yuri Doroshenko, Semyon Zolotaryov, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Krivonishenko, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol. They were not described in the official case file as reckless novices. The file stated that they were sufficiently trained for a Category 3 difficulty trek and had the necessary equipment and food. This matters because the later mystery depends on competence. If the group had been unprepared from the beginning, the case would be less resistant. Instead, the record gives us trained people, a planned route, winter conditions, and a final campsite that became a forensic puzzle. On February 1st, 1959, the group pitched its tent on the eastern slope of height 1079, known as Kholat Syakhl. Mount Otorten, their intended summit goal, lay about 10 kilometers away in a straight line. According to the 1959 resolution, the group had begun ascending at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and ended up roughly 500 to 600 meters left of the intended pass between heights 1079 and 880. Investigators later estimated that the tent was being installed around 5 o'clock in the evening, partly from the final camera frame showing snow excavation for the tent. Those details sound procedural, but they define the scene. The hikers did not merely sleep in a forest clearing. They cut or prepared a platform in snow on an exposed mountain slope during strong wind and extreme cold. The case file recorded temperatures of about -25 to -30 degrees Celsius when they camped there. Later scientific work would focus on the same kind of detail: slope geometry, wind-loaded snow, a buried weak layer, terrain steps, and the possibility that the snow cut made for the tent changed the stability of the slab above them. When searchers found the tent on February 26, 1959, it still held the ordinary inventory of survival. Food was there. Shoes were there. Outer clothing was there. Personal belongings were there. Diaries were there. The hikers were not. The tent itself became one of the most important pieces of physical evidence. The 1959 case file states that it was cut from the inside in 2 places on the lee side, allowing people to exit through the cuts. This is not a rumor added years later for drama. It is part of the investigative record. It does not prove an avalanche by itself. It does not prove panic by itself, but it does establish that the emergency, whatever it was experienced from inside the shelter. From the tent, investigators recorded 8 to 9 pairs of footprints leading away. Some impressions showed bare or socked feet. Others showed felt boots or soft footwear. The tracks were preserved for up to 500 meters below the tent before disappearing under snow near the forest edge. This line of movement is one reason the case remains so unsettling. The hikers appear to have gone away from the one structure that held their supplies, down toward the forest boundary, in conditions where delay could be fatal. The official record also states that there were no signs of struggle and no traces of other people in or near the tent. In a true crime frame, that absence is not a small thing. It means the archive does not begin by giving us a confirmed assailant. It gives us a scene that looks violent in consequence, but not in the ordinary signs of human attack. The first bodies found near the forest boundary were Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivenchenko. They were discovered near the remains of a fire, about 1,500 meters from the tent. That fire is a quiet but crucial detail. It suggests not instant death, but survival effort. Someone reached the trees. Someone tried to make heat. Someone understood, at least for a time, that the night could still be fought. 3 others were found between that fire area and the tent. Igor Dyatlov, Rustem Slobodin, and Zenaida Kolmogorova lay on a line interpreted by the investigator as an attempted return toward the shelter. The positions are painful because they suggest direction and failure, away from the fire, back toward what had been abandoned, but not far enough. The last 4 were found later, on May 4th, 1959. Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov were under 4 to 4.5 meters of snow near the 4th tributary of the Lozva. Their discovery changed the emotional weight of the case. The forensic material attributed the deaths of Dyatlov, Doroshenko, Krivonishenko, Kolmogorova, and Kolovatov primarily to low-temperature exposure, but Dubinina, Zolotaryov, and Thibault-Brignol had severe traumatic injuries. Dubinina's autopsy recorded multiple bilateral rib fractures and internal bleeding. Zolotaryov had fractures of right ribs along peristernal and mid-axillary lines. Thibault-Brignol had a crushed skull fracture described in the case file with a bone defect. In Dubinina's report, facial soft tissue loss and wrinkling of extremities were described as post-mortem changes associated with decomposition and water exposure. That distinction matters. The archive contains disturbing injuries, but it also contains medical explanations for some of the details that later became detached from context. On May 28, 1959, the criminal case was terminated. The conclusion stated that an overwhelming force caused the deaths and that there was no corpus delicti. In legal terms, the file did not establish a crime. In cultural terms, the phrase left a vacuum, overwhelming force, could sound like nature. It could also sound like an unfinished sentence. Decades later, official and scientific reviews returned to the mountain with a more specific natural mechanism in mind. In February 2019, the Russian Prosecutor General's office announced a review prioritizing natural explanations, including avalanche, snow slab, and hurricane-force snowstorm, rather than criminal versions. On July 11, 2020, TASS reported that Andrei Kuryakov of the Russian Prosecutor General's office said prosecutors concluded an avalanche killed the Dyatlov group. Then came peer-reviewed studies. A 2021 paper in Communications, Earth and Environment proposed that a small slab avalanche could have been released by the combination of the hikers' snowcut, irregular terrain, a buried weak layer, and strong katabatic winds depositing wind-blown snow. A 2022 follow-up reported field evidence that slopes near Dyatlov Pass are avalanche-prone, including documented slab avalanches on an eastern slope less than 3 kilometers from the tent location. This does not erase debate. It does not turn every uncertainty into a solved equation, but it changes the question from what monster entered the camp to could a specific mountain process have forced rational people into a fatal sequence. A slab does not need a motive. Wind does not leave fingerprints. Snow can move after a delay, under darkness, after a cut has weakened a slope and after weather has loaded it from above. The case that refuses to stay closed is not powerful because it lacks evidence. It is powerful because the evidence is concrete and incomplete at the same time. A tent on Kholat Syakhl cuts from the inside, tracks into the cold. No struggle. No other people. Bodies divided between exposure and trauma. A final official phrase. Overwhelming force. Before the last night can be weighed, the route itself has to be restored from the file. Sverdlovsk, Ivdel, Vizhai, 2nd Northern, Mount Otorten, Kholat Syakhl, the North Toshimka River, and back again. The mountain did not receive strangers without a plan. It received a trained party moving through a documented winter itinerary, step by step, toward the slope where the archive begins to darken. To understand why the evidence on Kholat Syakhl became so difficult to interpret, the journey has to be followed before it became a case file. Not from the torn tent backward, but from the planned line forward. Sverdlovsk to Ivdel, Ivdel to Vizhay, Vizhay to 2nd Northern, and then into the northern Urals, toward Mount Otorten and beyond. The route matters because it shows intent. It shows preparation. It shows that the party was not wandering blindly into a forbidden landscape, but moving along an approved winter itinerary, whose difficulty was known before they left. The group departed Sverdlovsk on January 23, 1959. At that time, Sverdlovsk was not a name associated with mystery in this story. It was the point of departure, the city from which a Ural Polytechnic Institute ski trekking party began a Category 3 route through the northern Urals. Category 3 was a serious classification. It meant a demanding expedition, not a casual excursion, and in the official case file, the hikers were described as sufficiently trained for it. The file also stated that they had the necessary equipment and food. That detail is easy to pass over because the later scene is so disturbing. A tent abandoned, shoes and clothing left behind, bodies found in separate places, and a final official conclusion that spoke of an overwhelming force. But the description of the party before departure is one of the most important anchors in the record. The official investigation did not begin from the assumption that these were unprepared people who had simply misjudged winter. It recorded them as trained, equipped, and supplied for the route they intended to ski. Their planned journey had a defined structure. The route listed in the official materials ran from Sverdlovsk through Ivdel, then onward through Vizhai and 2nd Northern. From there, the line entered the more remote mountain section, Mount Otorten, Kholat Syakhl, the North Toshimka River, and then back through Vizhay, Ivdel, and Sverdlovsk. In expanded descriptions of the itinerary, the path also included Sarov, the Ospia River, and the Upper Lozva River Pass, with Mount Otorten identified as a main objective. The shape of that route tells us something about the expedition's logic. It was not a straight dash to one summit. It was a winter traverse through settlement, logging outpost, river valleys, pass country, mountain slopes, and back to known communication points. The party would begin in the industrial and institutional world of Sverdlovsk, pass through the transport nodes of the region, then move into country where roads, shelter, and rescue became less certain. Each stage took them farther from routine Soviet infrastructure and deeper into terrain where weather, distance, and navigation would become the controlling facts. From Sverdlovsk, the route moved north toward Ivdel. Ivdel was not the mystery. It was one of the last larger names on the route, a point of passage before the landscape narrowed into smaller settlements and more isolated tracks. From Ivdel, the party would reach Vizhai, another important marker in the expedition record. Vizhai was not only a way station on the outward route, it was also the place they were expected to return to before sending word back. The group was later expected to telegraph the Ural Polytechnic Institute Sports Club after reaching Vizhay, a fact that would become important when no message arrived. But at the beginning, that expected telegram belonged to a normal plan. Leave Sverdlovsk. Move through Ivdel and Vizhay. Continue to 2nd Northern. Enter the mountain section. Complete the route. Return to Vizhay. Notify the sports club. Come home through Ivdel and Sverdlovsk. In the archive, the itinerary reads with a kind of administrative calm. Place names follow place names, like stations in an expedition ledger. Only later does each name take on a heavier sound. 2nd Northern was one of those threshold points. It stood near the edge between the reachable and the remote. The group would travel there before continuing into the region where their ski route would become more exposed. In the later history of the case, Second Northern carries another significance as well, because it is where Yuri Yudin turned back due to illness. But before we arrive at that break in the party, it is important to hold the wider route in view. Second Northern was not the destination. It was the doorway. Beyond it, the itinerary pointed toward Mount Otorten. Otorten was the intended summit goal, the mountain that gave the route much of its purpose. In the official resolution, the tent later found on the eastern slope of height 1079 lay about 10 kilometers in a straight line from Mount Otorten. That distance is small on a map and severe in winter terrain. It reminds us that the final camp was not placed at the intended objective itself. It was positioned along the approach, in the mountain country through which the party had to move in order to reach its goal. The planned route then continued toward Kholat Syakhl. In some archival route descriptions, this appears as Kholat Syakhl, with a recorded elevation of 1,322 meters. The naming variations belong to the record of the region, but the function in the route is clear. After Otorten, the party expected to move onward, not simply turn back from a single peak. The expedition had been planned as a Category 3 ski trek of substantial distance, described in Dyatlov Pass archival material as roughly 250 kilometers, with an expected span from January 23rd into mid-February of 1959. The next major natural marker was the North Toshkemka River, also rendered in some route descriptions as the North Toshkemka River. River valleys mattered in winter travel because they could guide movement through mountain country, but they also brought their own risks: cold air pooling, difficult crossings, changing snow, and long distances between shelter. The official route then bent back toward Vizhai, and from there through Ivdel and Sverdlovsk. In other words, the journey had a planned exit. It had a return chain. It had an anticipated point at which the remote traverse would rejoin the world of telegrams, institutions, and waiting families. That is why the route should not be treated as background decoration. It is part of the evidence of expectation. The party left with a plan that could be checked, followed, and eventually searched. When they did not return on schedule, the known itinerary gave the first shape to the search. It told rescuers where they might have gone, what valleys or passes might matter, and why the silence from Vizhay was meaningful. Before the tent was found, the route was the map of concern. The official case file's assessment of the hikers also shapes how the later evidence should be read. A sudden emergency on Kholat Syakhl did not happen to people officially described as incapable of the route. It happened to a trained group on a difficult but planned winter expedition. They had food. They had equipment. They had experience sufficient for a Category 3 trek. That does not make disaster impossible. In mountain travel, competence reduces risk. It does not abolish it. But it does narrow the way we talk about the decisions that followed. When the later record shows equipment, food, shoes, outer clothing, personal belongings, and diaries still inside the tent, the earlier record of preparation makes the contradiction sharper. They were not unprepared because they lacked supplies. The supplies were there. They were not untrained in the general sense recorded by the file. The file says the opposite. Something in the conditions of that final night separated trained people from the materials they needed to survive. That is the quiet force of the itinerary. Sverdlovsk, Ivdel, Vizhai, Second Northern, Mount Otorten, Kholat Syakhl, the North Toshkemka River, Vizhai, Ivdel, Sverdlovsk. Read one way, it is a route plan. Read after the fact, it is a corridor narrowing toward one slope. Each place marks a stage in the removal of ordinary safeguards. The farther the party moved, the more weather mattered. The more terrain mattered. The more a delay, a wrong line in poor visibility, or a dangerous slope could change the meaning of a whole expedition. The record does not require us to imagine carelessness at the outset. It asks something more difficult: to follow competent people into a landscape where competence met conditions beyond easy control. The northern Urals in late January were not an empty backdrop. They were the central mechanism of the journey, the thing the party intended to cross and the thing that would later be examined as a possible cause. On January 23, 1959, 10 people left Sverdlovsk under that plan. For a time, the story still belonged to schedules, trains, settlements, supplies, maps, and a return telegram expected from Vijay. Then, at Second Northern, the route divided in the most human way possible. Illness forced one member to turn back. The others continued toward the mountain section. From that point forward, the expedition became the story of 10 names reduced to 9 travelers, and one survivor left behind by circumstance before the northern Urals closed around the rest. At Second Northern, the journey stopped being only a line on the route plan and became a record of people making a decision under ordinary pressure. Not a dramatic decision, not one that would have seemed prophetic at the time, but a practical one. One member was too ill to continue, and the remaining 9 carried on. That is the first human fracture in the file. The party that left Sverdlovsk had numbered 10. The names are often recited now with the weight of a memorial, but in the documents of the route, they were still a functioning ski trekking group from the world of institutes, sports clubs, winter trails, and planned achievement. Igor Dyatlov was the leader. With him were Lyudmila Dubinina, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Alexander Kolevatov, Yuri Doroshenko, Semyon Zolotaryov, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Krivonishenko, Nikolai Thibaut Brignol, and Yuri Yudin. The names matter because the case can become distorted when the group is treated only as a mystery. They were not symbols walking into a legend. They were individuals on a documented Category 3 ski trek through the northern Urals, a route the official file would describe as within their training and equipment. The later evidence is severe. An abandoned tent, footprints in the snow, bodies found over distance and time, exposure, traumatic injury, and official language about an overwhelming force. But before all of that, the archive preserves something quieter. It preserves a group moving through the early stages of a winter expedition, still making ordinary judgments. The stop at Second Northern belongs to that category. Second Northern was not the final mountain site. It was one of the last named points before the route entered its more remote section. Behind the group were Sverdlovsk, Ivdel, and Vijay. Ahead lay the Auspia River area, the upper Lozva River Pass, Mount Otorten, Oiko Chakur, the North Toshemka River, and eventually the return through Vijay and Ivdel to Sverdlovsk. The expedition still had a shape. It had an expected conclusion. It had a telegram due later from Vijay to the Ural Polytechnic Institute Sports Club. At Second Northern, that future still existed as a schedule, not as a search operation. Yuri Yudin turned back there because illness prevented him from continuing. In many retellings, that fact is made to carry too much theatrical weight. It is presented almost as a supernatural escape, as though the route itself chose one person to release. The archive does not require that. It gives a simpler and more painful structure. A member of the party became ill. He could not continue. The route divided. Yudin returned, and the others moved on. The tragedy is not made smaller by keeping it ordinary. It becomes clearer. Yudin's return is one of the few points in the case where the outcome is known with terrible certainty. The one person who left the route survived. The 9 who continued entered the remote conditions that would later define the investigation. That contrast has become inseparable from the story, but it should not be mistaken for evidence of a hidden design. It is evidence of circumstance, timing, and the way a group expedition can narrow without anyone understanding what has changed. For the 9, continuing was consistent with the plan. The record does not show that they were unprepared, reckless, or outside the expected competence for the route. The official material described the hikers as sufficiently trained and said they had the necessary equipment and food. That detail has to remain in view because it prevents an easy explanation from settling too early. They were not simply lost amateurs. They were a trained group on a difficult winter route, moving through terrain where preparation mattered but did not erase risk. Igor Dyatlov's name has become attached to the pass itself, but in this chapter, he is still the leader of an expedition in motion. Lyudmila Dubinina and Zinaida Kolmogorova were not later case details. They were members of the original party, traveling under the same plan and into the same conditions. Alexander Kolevatov, Yuri Doroshenko, Semyon Zolotaryov, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Krivonishenko, and Nikolai Thibaut Brignol were likewise part of a collective movement through the northern Urals. The record later separates them by where they were found and by what the forensic material recorded. But at Second Northern, the dividing line was not between tent, cedar, slope, ravine, exposure, and trauma. It was only between one sick hiker and 9 who could still continue. That is why Second Northern is so important to the structure of the case. It is the last point where the group can be counted as 10 and the first point where the final number is fixed. After Yudin turned back, the remaining 9 were the party that would be expected to complete the route and send word after reaching Vizhai. They were the party that would later build a cache in the upper Hospia River area. They were the party that would attempt to cross toward the Lozva River valley and be forced back by low temperature and strong wind. They were the party that would ascend toward the pass between height 1079 and height 880 and end up on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. They were the party whose tent would be found on February 26, 1959, with equipment, food, shoes, outer clothing, personal belongings, blankets, backpacks, storm jackets, trousers, and diaries still inside. But none of those later facts were visible yet. At Second Northern, the most important force in the story still looked like illness, not avalanche conditions, not a cut tent, not footprints leaving shelter, not an investigation searching for signs of other people and finding none. Just a person whose body would not allow him to continue on skis into a harder section of the northern Urals. That detail also helps explain why the case should be approached without turning the hikers into characters in a horror scene. The final evidence is strange enough without exaggeration. The people involved do not need to be made mysterious. Their ordinariness is part of the record. They were students, graduates, and companions on a serious winter trek associated with the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They carried equipment and food. They followed a route. They made adjustments. One of them became ill and left. 9 remained. The emotional force of that reduction is unavoidable, but it is not proof of anything by itself. It is the hinge on which the archive turns. From this point forward, every later question applies only to the 9 who continued. Who pitched the tent on the eastern slope? Who left it suddenly? Who moved away in the dark and cold? Who reached the forest boundary? Who tried, or seemed to try, to manage survival after shelter had been abandoned? But the first narrowing came before any of the famous evidence appeared. It came when Yudin's illness removed him from the route, leaving the rest of the group to continue into conditions that were still, at that moment, part of a planned expedition. There is a difficult restraint required here. Because Yudin survived, he can seem to stand outside the case, as the witness who was spared. But in the chronology, he belongs inside the expedition until Second Northern. His survival was not caused by special knowledge of what lay ahead. It followed from a medical limitation at a specific place on the route. The archive gives no reason to turn that into omen or conspiracy. It gives a more human fact. He could not go on. The 9 could. And so the story moves with them. After Second Northern, the populated parts of the route fell farther behind. The group's decisions became increasingly shaped by terrain, weather, and the practical burdens of winter travel. Their competence still mattered. Their planning still mattered. But the environment began to press more directly on each choice. The route toward Mount Otorten was no longer simply an itinerary approved in advance. It was snow, wind, river valleys, passes, and distance from quick help. This is where the later investigation begins to find its first quiet foundations. Not in a single dramatic mistake, but in ordinary expedition management under worsening conditions. The group had to decide when to move, where to stop, what to carry, what to leave behind, and how to respond when cold and wind complicated the intended line. Those choices would later be read backward from a fatal outcome, but at the time, they were the normal business of winter travel. The tragedy of Second Northern is that nothing in the record suggests the remaining 9 understood they had crossed into the final shape of the case. They were not yet the Dyatlov Pass victims. They were Dyatlov's group, reduced by illness, continuing along a demanding route. Their names were still attached to movement rather than discovery, to plans rather than evidence. Yuri Yudin's return left one life on the safe side of the divide. The others moved deeper into the northern Urals, toward the Ospia River area, toward the low temperature and strong wind that would soon force a change of plan, and toward the cache they would build before the final ascent From that point, the file begins to show not only who they were, but how carefully they were still trying to manage the mountain before the mountain became the scene. From the moment Yuri Yudin turned back, the remaining 9 were no longer traveling with the full party that had left Sverdlovsk. But the archive does not show panic after that division. It shows continued expedition work, route choices, weather judgment, load management, and the ordinary calculations of a winter ski trek in remote country. That is what makes the final known decisions so important. They are not dramatic on their face. They do not look like clues in the way a cut tent later looks like a clue, or a line of footprints later looks like a clue. They belong to the practical side of the journey, the side that experienced hikers understand without needing to make speeches about it. A group tests a pass. A group turns back when the conditions are wrong. A group builds a supply cache before climbing higher. A group leaves behind what it does not need for the next section. Only afterward, when the tent was found on the eastern slope of height 1079 and 9 lives had been lost, did these ordinary choices become part of the evidence. They showed that the group was still thinking ahead. They showed that the route was being managed. And they showed that the weather was already pressing against the plan before the fatal camp was ever made. The first of these decisions came on January 31st, 1959. By then, Dyatlov's group had moved into the Ospia River area, approaching the higher terrain that would lead toward the Lozva River Valley, and, beyond that, the objective of Mount Otorten. The planned journey had always required the party to leave settlements behind and move through winter Ural landscape by ski, carrying the food and equipment necessary for a Category 3 trek. The file had already described them as sufficiently trained and equipped for that undertaking. But training does not remove weather. Equipment does not cancel wind. A route plan can set a direction, but it cannot compel a mountain pass to open at the hour chosen on paper. On January 31st, the group tried to cross toward the Lozva River Valley. That phrase in the record is simple. It does not ask for atmosphere. It does not need adjectives. The group tried to cross, but the circumstances attached to that attempt are important. Low temperature and strong wind. Those 2 conditions were enough to make the party turn back. In a sensational telling, turning back might be framed as failure. In an archive report, it is almost the opposite. It is evidence of judgment. A winter expedition does not survive by insisting on every planned movement at any cost. It survives by reading conditions and accepting delay when the terrain and weather require it. The group had set out from Sverdlovsk with a route, but the route still had to be negotiated hour by hour. On January 31st, that negotiation favored retreat. The decision also tells us that the conditions were not simply cold in a general winter sense. The research record preserves low temperature and strong wind as the reason the crossing did not continue. That matters because, by the time the final camp was made, cold and wind would not be background details. They would become central to the physical possibilities of the case, what a person could endure outside a shelter, how quickly exposure could overwhelm, how difficult visibility and navigation could become, and how wind could shape snow on an open slope. The January 31st retreat is therefore one of the quiet boundary markers in the story. Before it, the group is advancing along the intended line. After it, the archive shows the mountain beginning to impose its own conditions on the itinerary. There is still no mystery in the criminal sense. No evidence of another party appears here. No confrontation appears. No sign of disorder appears. What appears is environmental pressure. The following day, February 1st, 1959, the group made another practical decision. They built a labaz. A labaz is a supply cache, and in this case, it was built in the upper Ospia River area. The purpose was straightforward. The hikers left food and unneeded equipment there before continuing. For a ski trekking party, this kind of cache can reduce the weight carried into the next stage and preserve supplies for the return or for a later portion of the route. It is the kind of work that belongs to disciplined travel. It takes time. It requires intention. It assumes there will be a future moment when the cache matters. That is why the labaz is so stark when viewed from the other side of the tragedy. The cache was not an act of abandonment. It was an act of planning. The group did not behave like people who had lost the route completely or surrendered control of the expedition. They were sorting necessities from non-necessities. They were managing loads. They were preparing for the movement ahead. In the later case, that fact becomes significant because it helps define the state of the group before the ascent. They were not yet in the kind of emergency that would later be inferred from the tent cuts and the abandoned equipment. They were making rational expedition decisions. The Labaz suggests that, on the morning and early part of February 1st, the party was still operating within the normal logic of the trek. The location also matters. The cache was made in the upper Ospia River area before the group moved toward the pass between height 1079 and height 880. This placed the Labaz in the last known zone of deliberate preparation before the hikers left the more sheltered river area and entered the exposed terrain that would lead to Kholat Syakhl. It marks the transition between one kind of landscape and another, from river-valley travel and cache building to ascent, navigation, wind, open slope, and the final campsite. There is a temptation, in cases like this, to search every last routine act for hidden dread. But the better reading is quieter. The Labaz matters precisely because it is routine. It shows that the party expected the route to continue. They were not scattering belongings in panic. They were not discarding equipment randomly. They were choosing what to leave and what to carry, according to the demands of the route as they understood them. This is one reason the Dyatlov case has remained so difficult. The final evidence seems abrupt, almost violently so. The tent later found on the slope still contained vital items. The footprints led away into lethal cold. Several members died from exposure, while others had severe traumatic injuries. But immediately before that final phase, the record shows not chaos, but competence. It shows a group that turned back when low temperature and wind made a crossing unsafe, then built a supply cache to manage the next leg of the expedition. Those details narrow the emotional range of the story. They do not allow us to imagine a reckless party rushing blindly into the mountains. They also do not allow us to imagine a group already broken by fear before reaching the slope. The known record places them somewhere more ordinary and more unsettling, experienced enough to make sound decisions, yet still vulnerable to conditions beyond their control. The January 31st retreat and the February 1st Labaz also help explain why later avalanche reviews focus so closely on terrain, snow, wind, and the placement of the tent. If the group had been careless from the start, the explanation might rest on simple misjudgment. But the archive does not support that easy conclusion. These hikers were managing their route. They were responding to weather. They were reducing loads before ascent. The fatal question is not whether they knew they were in winter mountains. They clearly did. The question is, what changed after those decisions, when a managed expedition became an emergency on the slope? The weather, already present in the record, cannot be treated as decorative. Low temperature and strong wind stopped the attempted crossing on January 31st. The same broader pattern of severe winter conditions would frame the later camp on height 1079, where the case file recorded temperatures around -25 to -30 degrees Celsius with strong wind. That does not prove a single event by itself, but it means the final night must be read in continuity with the conditions already shaping the party's choices. In that sense, the last ordinary decisions are not just prelude. They are part of the mechanism of the story. The group's retreat tells us the environment was forceful enough to alter the route. The Labaz tells us the group still intended to continue in an organized way. Together, they place the hikers at a precise point before the disaster, not lost in legend, not yet fixed in death, but alive inside the ordinary labor of expedition travel. They had tried one way and turned back. They had cached supplies. They had lightened their loads. The route ahead still pointed toward the upper Lozva side, toward Mount Otorten, toward the pass between height 1079 and height 880. By the afternoon of February 1st, the last routine preparations were behind them. The next movement would take them upward. According to the 1959 resolution, the group began ascending at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Somewhere in that ascent, under the pressure of terrain, weather, and visibility, the line of travel shifted. The party that had been making careful choices in the upper Ospia River area would end up hundreds of meters left of the intended pass, on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, where the last camp would be cut into the snow. By the afternoon of February 1st, the Dyatlov group had already made the kind of decisions that belong to experienced travel in winter mountains. They had turned back from an attempted crossing when the cold and wind made progress unreasonable. They had built the labaz in the upper Ospia River area and left food and unneeded equipment there. They had reduced weight before moving higher. In the archive, these are not the actions of a party wandering without method. They are the actions of people trying to keep a difficult route under control. Then the landscape began to take some of that control back. The 1959 resolution gives the next movement with unusual importance. On February 1st, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the group began ascending. Their intended direction was toward the pass between height 1079 and height 880. That pass mattered because it was part of the route leading toward Mount Otorten, the goal that still lay beyond them in the northern Urals. But the same resolution records that they did not arrive where they meant to. Instead, during the ascent, the group ended up roughly 500 to 600 meters to the left of the intended pass. That measurement is easy to read too quickly. 500 meters. 600 meters. On a city street, it sounds like a simple error, a wrong turn that could be corrected by looking up, turning around, and walking back. But on a cold mountain slope and poor visibility, with wind moving snow across the terrain, that distance becomes something else. It becomes a record of conditions. It becomes evidence of what the hikers were moving through before the tent ever became a scene. The archive does not need us to turn that drift into incompetence. The earlier record argues against that. The official case file described the hikers as sufficiently trained for a Category 3 ski trek and equipped with necessary food and equipment. Their decisions on January 31st and February 1st show planning, not confusion. They responded to low temperature and strong wind, then prepared a cache to manage the next stage. So when the resolution says they came out several hundred meters left of the intended pass, the more careful question is not why trained people made a mistake. The more careful question is what the mountain was doing around them. The answer begins with visibility. In open winter terrain, especially above the forest boundary, distance can become deceptive. A ridge, a saddle, and a slope can flatten into a single pale field. The line between sky and snow can narrow or disappear. Wind can erase recent traces and soften older ones. The route between two heights may be clear on a map and much less clear when the party is inside moving air, blowing snow, and late afternoon light. February 1st was not a calm summer approach to a marked pass. It was a winter ascent in the northern Urals after the group had already encountered conditions severe enough to force them back the day before. The route they wanted lay between height 1079 and height 880. Height 1079 is Kholat Syakhl, the mountain whose eastern slope would become fixed in the case file. To navigate toward a pass between two heights, the party needed to maintain orientation while climbing through terrain that was not just uphill, but exposed. Every choice of line would be shaped by wind, snow cover, slope angle, and what they could actually see. A small divergence early in an ascent could grow into hundreds of meters by the time the group realized that the pass was not where they expected it to be. And here, the timing matters. They began ascending at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This was not the beginning of a full day's travel. It was the final portion of a day that had already included work at the labaz. By the time they were moving upward, there was limited daylight left. The investigation would later estimate that the tent was being installed around 5 o'clock in the evening, using, among other things, the final camera frame showing snow excavation for the tent. That gives a narrow window between the start of the ascent and the decision to make camp. Within that window, they had to climb, assess position, manage the weather, and decide whether to continue, correct course, or stop. The resolutions note that they were 500 to 600 meters left of the intended pass is therefore not a minor route detail. It locates the last camp as the result of a specific environmental sequence. They were not simply placed on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl by accident in the abstract. They were carried there by the combined effects of terrain, wind, visibility, timing, and the demands of winter travel. The slope became the outcome of the day's movement. There is a temptation, in cases like this, to turn every deviation into a clue about psychology, fear, argument, irrationality, bad judgment. But the archive is quieter than that. It records an ascent, an intended pass, and a displacement to the left. It records no struggle. It records no outside tracks at the tent. The evidence that comes later may feel dramatic, but this moment is still a navigation problem inside a hard landscape. That is important because the place where the tent stood would shape every later interpretation. A tent in the forest would mean one set of assumptions. A tent on a sheltered valley floor would mean another. But this tent was on the eastern slope of height 1079. It was exposed. It was on snow. It was high enough and open enough for wind to matter intensely. In later reviews, especially those focused on avalanche and snow slab mechanisms, the exact placement of the tent would become central. Not because the hikers had made a foolish choice, but because the slope, the snowpack, and the wind were all part of the physical scene. The later scientific discussion would focus on whether a small slab avalanche could have been released by the combination of a snowcut made for the tent, irregular terrain, a buried weak layer, and strong katabatic winds depositing wind-blown snow. Those later models depend on the same basic fact preserved in the older case materials. The tent was not in the intended pass. It was on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. To understand the fatal night, the position of that camp cannot be treated as background. It is one of the first facts that links route finding to hazard. Even before any avalanche hypothesis is considered, the displacement tells us the conditions were limiting the group's ability to read the mountain. A pass between two heights is a navigational target. Missing it by 500 to 600 meters means the visual and environmental cues were compromised, or that correcting the line was no longer the best option as darkness and weather pressed in. The group may have understood they were not precisely where they intended to be. They may have chosen to stop rather than continue in worsening conditions. The archive does not preserve their discussion. It preserves the result, and the result was a camp cut into the slope. That phrase matters, cut into the slope. The final photograph, later used by investigators in estimating the time, showed snow excavation for the tent. The hikers were not merely dropping their packs and waiting. They were making a platform. They were adapting the mountain surface into a place where 9 people could sleep. That is ordinary expedition practice, but in this case, it also becomes a mechanical detail. Snow was being removed. A shelter was being set into a winter slope. The surrounding snow and wind conditions would later be examined not as scenery, but as forces capable of changing the safety of the camp after it was built. For now, at this point in the record, the scene remains before the catastrophe. There is no torn shelter yet in the narrative, no footprints leading away, no fire at the forest boundary. There is only a party of 9, late on February 1st, having climbed from the upper Ospia River area after leaving their cache, trying to move toward the pass between height 1079 and height 880, and ending up left of that line. 500 to 600 meters is not far enough to remove them from the route entirely. It is far enough to place them in different terrain. That difference is the hinge. In a winter mountain environment, a few hundred meters can change exposure to wind. It can change snow accumulation. It can change the angle beneath a tent. It can change what lies above the camp and how drifting snow is deposited through the evening. The official file does not require us to imagine a mysterious detour. It asks us to notice that the final camp came after a measurable navigational drift under difficult conditions. By the time the group stopped, Mount Otorten was still about 10 kilometers away in a straight line. The intended summit remained ahead. The route was not complete. The day had narrowed into the practical problem of shelter. They were on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, and the weather that had already shaped their decisions was still present around them. The archive's next fixed point is the tent itself, its location, its contents, and the estimate that the hikers were installing it around 5 o'clock in the evening. Before the night became evidence, it was a camp being made in wind and cold, on a slope that the group had reached not through carelessness, but through the hard arithmetic of winter navigation. The final camp begins, in the file, not as a mystery, but as a task. After the drift from the intended pass, after the upward movement that placed the group on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, the 9 hikers had to do what winter travelers do when the day is nearly gone. They had to stop. They had to make a level place in the snow. They had to raise canvas, secure it against wind, and turn an exposed mountainside into shelter. The location matters because it fixes the whole later investigation to one particular slope. The tent was pitched on the eastern slope of height 1079, the mountain known as Kholat Syakhl. Mount Otorten, the intended goal of the route, lay about 10 kilometers away in a straight line. The hikers had not reached it. They were still short of the summit objective, still in the travel phase of the expedition, still moving through the country described in their planned Category 3 ski trek. But at roughly 5 o'clock in the evening on February 1st, 1959, the evidence places them not in motion, but at work on their last camp. That estimate, about 5 o'clock, did not come from a clock found ticking in the snow. It came from the investigation's reconstruction of what was visible in the last known photographic material. The case file refers to a final camera frame showing the excavation of snow for the tent. The technical analysis recorded exposure settings, aperture, and film sensitivity, treating the image not as a souvenir, but as evidence. In that frame, the ordinary labor of winter camping became a timestamp. Snow was being cut and cleared. A platform was being prepared. The camera had captured a moment before the emergency, when the group was still solving the normal problem in front of them. The problem was severe enough on its own. The 1959 case file recorded temperatures of about -25 to -30 degrees Celsius with strong wind when the group camped on height 1079. Those numbers should not be treated as background atmosphere. They define the practical world inside which every later choice had to occur. At -25 degrees Celsius, exposed hands lose usefulness quickly. At -30, the margin narrows further. Wind strips heat from clothing, pushes loose snow across the slope, and turns a delay into a hazard. A tent in those conditions is not comfort. It is survival infrastructure. It is a barrier, a place to organize clothing and boots, a place to get out of the direct force of weather, a place where the group can make the next day's decision with bodies still warm enough to act. The archive does not say that the hikers were surprised by winter. It says the opposite in other places. They had been described as sufficiently trained and equipped for the route. Their previous decisions showed winter judgment, turning back when low temperature and strong wind made a crossing unreasonable, then building the labas in the upper Ospia River area to reduce load before the ascent. On Kholat Syakhl, the same pattern continues for a little while. They stop. They work. They make camp. But the place where they made that camp has become one of the central physical facts of the incident. The tent was not in the forest. It was not tucked below the trees, where wood and shelter might have offered some protection. It was on an open eastern slope. That choice has been argued over for decades, but the archive allows a simpler starting point. By late afternoon, in low visibility and strong wind, after ending up hundreds of meters left of the intended pass, the group chose or accepted the available stopping place. They were on a mountainside. The day was ending, and the weather had already imposed its terms. To pitch a tent on snow is to change the snow. The last photograph, with its excavation for the tent, is important for that reason. The hikers were not merely setting canvas on top of a surface. They were cutting and shaping a platform. They were making a flat sleeping area in a sloped winter landscape. Later avalanche reviews would pay close attention to that kind of disturbance, not because it proves any single sequence by itself, but because a snow cut on a slope becomes part of the physical setting. The 2021 scientific paper would argue that a small snow slab avalanche could have been released by a combination of the hikers' cut into the snow, irregular terrain, a buried weak layer, and strong katabatic winds depositing wind-blown snow. That analysis belongs later in the episode, but the first ingredient is already here in the file. The camp was excavated into snow on the slope. The word small can be misleading when applied to a slab. It can sound harmless, but on a mountain in darkness, under canvas, with people partly undressed for rest, even a limited movement of snow can become a violent event. For now, though, the chapter remains at the hour before any inferred release. The hikers are still alive. The tent is still being installed. The line between expedition routine and fatal evidence has not yet been crossed. There is a quiet cruelty in that final image. It does not show fear. It does not show an attacker. It does not show struggle. It shows work. The kind of work the group had done many times before. Shovel snow, shape the sleeping place, secure the tent, get inside, survive the night, continue the route. Because the file preserves so much of what came after, it is easy to read the photograph backward and make every action ominous. But to understand the camp, we have to hold it first as the hikers would have held it, an exposed but functional stop on a difficult winter traverse. The slope itself would later become an argument. Some early objections to avalanche explanations emphasized that the average angle near the tent appeared too gentle for a typical avalanche. Later field and modeling work complicated that picture, describing local terrain steps, wind loading, and slab conditions that could exist even where the broader slope seemed less dramatic. The 2022 follow-up study reported field evidence that slopes near Dyatlov Pass are avalanche-prone, including documented slab avalanches on an eastern slope less than 3 kilometers from the tent location. Those later reviews do not erase uncertainty. They do, however, return attention to the same basic physical scene, a tent platform cut into snow on an eastern slope under strong wind and intense cold. The case file's weather detail is especially important because it removes the need to exaggerate the setting. There is no requirement to invent supernatural cold or impossible conditions. -25 to -30 degrees Celsius with strong wind is already enough to make the camp unforgiving. In such weather, the tent is the boundary between a controlled expedition and exposure. Inside are boots, clothing layers, equipment, food, notebooks, sleeping arrangements, and the collective order of a trained group. Outside is a slope in the northern Urals at night. That boundary would become the most disturbing object in the case. When searchers later found the tent, it would still hold many of the things needed for survival. But at the time of installation, none of that contradiction existed. The canvas was being raised so that people could remain inside it. The excavation in the snow was meant to make the shelter usable, not to become a clue. The final camera frame, therefore, has a double life. In one sense, it is ordinary expedition documentation, a photograph taken during camp preparation. In another, it is the last known visual record before the group disappears from its own archive. After that, the evidence becomes indirect. A tent found later, tracks in snow, bodies discovered at different distances, forensic reports, and decades of attempts to understand what pressure could have driven 9 people out of shelter into lethal cold. For the evening of February 1st, the facts remain narrow and stark. The group was on the eastern slope of height 1079. Mount Otorten was still about 10 kilometers away. The tent was being installed around 5 o'clock, an estimate supported partly by the final photograph of snow excavation. The temperature was about -25 to -30 degrees Celsius. Strong wind was present. The hikers were making camp in a place where weather, terrain, and snowpack were not scenery but active conditions. Then the mountain fell silent in the record. For days, no one outside the route knew that the camp on Kholat Syakhl had become the last camp. The Ural Polytechnic Institute sports club still had reason to expect a message after the group reached Vizhay. Families, friends, and officials were not yet looking at a crime scene or an avalanche path. They were waiting for a telegram from a hard winter route, and at first the absence of that telegram was only a delay. At first, the silence belonged to distance. The tent on Kholat Syakhl was not yet a discovered object in a file. It was not yet canvas under snow, with equipment still inside. It was not yet part of a criminal investigation or a prosecutor's resolution, or the beginning of decades of argument. For the people waiting far away from the eastern slope of height 1079, the story had a much simpler shape. A group of ski hikers had gone into the northern Urals. They had a route. They had a planned return. And after reaching Vizhay, they were expected to send a telegram to the Ural Polytechnic Institute Sports Club. That expected message was due by February 12, 1959. A telegram is a small thing in a large country, but in this case, it was the thread between the route and the world beyond it. The group had left Sverdlovsk in January with a plan that moved through rail stations, settlements, winter roads, river valleys, and mountain passes. The archive preserves that route as a sequence of places: Sverdlovsk, Ivdel, Vizhay, Second Northern, Mount Otorten, Oiko Chakur, the North Poshimka River, then back through Vizhay, Ivdel, and Sverdlovsk. It was not an improvised disappearance into blank space. It was an organized Category 3 ski trek, difficult by design, but still accountable to a plan. In that plan, Vizhay mattered because it was the place from which news could come out. The expected telegram was not a casual courtesy. It was part of the structure that connected a winter expedition to the institution that had approved it and the people who waited for the hikers' return. The Ural Polytechnic Institute Sports Club was not waiting for a diary entry or a story told later over tea. It was waiting for confirmation that the party had completed the demanding northern section and had come back into contact with the settled route. By February 12th, that message had not arrived. The temptation, when telling this case from the far side of discovery, is to load that date with everything that was later known. We know now that by February 12th, the 9 hikers were already dead. We know now that the last camp had been made on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. We know now that the bodies would be found in different places, some near the forest boundary, some on the line back toward the tent, and others much later under deep snow near a tributary of the Lazva. But the people waiting in February did not know any of that. They knew only that a telegram had not come. That difference matters. The missed telegram was not immediately a body count. It was not immediately proof of violence, avalanche, injury, or fatal exposure. It was first a failure of communication after a difficult winter route through remote terrain. In the northern Urals, delay could have several ordinary explanations before it became terrifying. Weather could slow travel. Deep snow could hold a group in place. Wind could force a retreat or a bivouac. A route could take longer than planned, especially if the party had already faced the same conditions recorded before the final camp: low temperature, strong wind, and difficult movement through mountain terrain. The group had already adjusted to those conditions before the silence began. On January 31st, they had tried to cross toward the Lozva River Valley and had turned back because of low temperature and strong wind. On February 1st, they had built the laybas in the upper Ospia River area, leaving food and unneeded equipment behind. Later that day, they had ascended toward the pass and ended up on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, away from the intended line between heights 1079 and 880. The record shows a group moving through pressure, not through ease. So when February 12th passed without the expected message, the absence could still be read inside the logic of winter travel. It was late. It was concerning. But it was not yet evidence laid out on snow. This is where the archive report tension changes shape. On the mountain, time had narrowed to immediate survival. Wind, canvas, snow, darkness, cold. Away from the mountain, time widened. It became calendar time. A date circled in expectation. Then the day after that date. Then another. The silence gained weight slowly, because it had to pass through uncertainty before it could become alarm. There is a particular kind of dread in a missed communication from a remote route. It does not announce itself with a single fact. It accumulates. At first, one can imagine a delay in reaching Vijay, then perhaps a delay in sending the telegram, then perhaps a misunderstanding about the return schedule. But each explanation has to survive the next quiet day. The longer the silence continues, the harder it becomes to keep the expedition inside the category of normal lateness. The Ural Polytechnic Institute Sports Club expected the group to report after reaching Vijay. Families and friends had their own waiting, more personal than institutional, but tied to the same missing signal. The party was not made of anonymous names in a file. It was led by Igor Dyatlov and included Lyudmila Dubinina, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Alexander Kolovatov, Yuri Doroshenko, Semyon Zolotaryov, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Krivonashenko, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol. Yuri Yudin, ill and unable to continue, had already turned back from 2nd Northern. That fact would later acquire a terrible clarity. One person had left the route and survived. The 9 who continued had entered the conditions that would define the investigation. But before the search, even that structure was not fully visible. The route was still the reference point. The expected telegram was still the missing piece. Search efforts began later in February. That timing is important because it shows how the case emerged into public and institutional awareness. The investigation did not begin with a witnessed disaster. There was no immediate report of an attack, no surviving member arriving with an account, no nearby settlement describing an event on the slope. The first sign was absence. The group had not made contact. The route that should have produced a message from Vijay had produced nothing. In the archive, this gives the case one of its most unsettling qualities. The disaster itself occurred in a place and time hidden from direct witnesses. The response began only after the expected line of communication failed. The people who went looking were not following smoke or cries or a known accident site. They were searching backward through a winter route, trying to locate a party whose last known movements had been left in diaries, photographs, and the geography of the northern Urals. The delay also shaped what would later be available as evidence. Snow keeps records, but not indefinitely and not completely. Wind rewrites surfaces. New snowfall covers old tracks. Cold preserves some things and destroys others. By the time searchers moved into the mountains, the final camp had been standing, buried, altered by weather, and separated from the outside world for weeks. The silence after February 12th was therefore not only emotional and institutional. It was evidentiary. Each day without contact also belonged to the mountain. And still, it would be too easy to turn the missing telegram into a dramatic omen. In the actual sequence, it was more ordinary than that, and more frightening because of its ordinariness. A sports club expected a message from its hikers. The route was hard. The winter was severe. The party was late. Concern grew into action. The phrase missing telegram can sound almost old-fashioned now, as if the technology makes the danger distant. But in 1959, on a remote Soviet ski route, that message was the practical sign that the group had crossed back from wilderness into contact. Without it, the waiting world had no clear image of what had happened. There was only the planned route, the expected date, and the widening gap between them. The search that followed would pull the hidden scene out of the snow piece by piece. It would move from institutions and families into forest, slope, and pass. It would replace uncertainty with objects: skis, poles, canvas, clothing, food, diaries, footprints. But before any of that could be cataloged, the case existed as a negative space in the records. No telegram from Vijay. No confirmation to the Ural Polytechnic Institute sports club. No return from a Category 3 winter trek through the northern Urals. By late February, that silence had become too heavy to explain away as delay. Searchers entered the route not knowing they were about to find one of the most studied scenes in Soviet mountain history. They were still looking for missing hikers. They were still trying to restore a line of contact that had broken somewhere beyond Vijay, beyond 2nd Northern, beyond the Labaz and the upper Ospia River area. Then, on February 26th, 1959, the waiting ended in a way no one could mistake for ordinary lateness. On the eastern slope of Height 1079, searchers found the tent. What made it horrifying was not only where it stood, but what remained inside. What remained inside changed the meaning of the search. Until February 26, 1959, the absence of the Dyatlov group could still be held, however uneasily, inside the category of delay. A difficult winter route could slow even trained hikers. Weather could disrupt movement. A missed telegram from Vijay was serious, but it was not yet a scene. It did not yet have an exact position on a slope or canvas under snow, or a list of objects that made the silence harder to explain. Then the searchers reached the eastern slope of Height 1079, Kholat Syakhl, and found the tent. In the record, this is one of the fixed points around which the entire case turns. The tent was not found near Vijay, not near 2nd Northern, not beside the Labaz in the upper Ospia River area, and not in the forest where a group might have chosen shelter from wind. It was found where the final camp had been made, on the open eastern slope of Height 1079, the same slope investigators would connect to the final photograph showing snow excavation for the tent, and the same slope where the case file placed the group in severe cold and strong wind. The discovery did not answer the central question. It sharpened it. A tent in the mountains can tell a simple story if its contents match the conditions outside. If a party leaves to continue a route, then packs, food, outer clothing, and footwear go with them. If a party deliberately abandons a camp, the most essential items are normally carried away. If a shelter becomes unusable, the survivors take what can be taken. In winter, especially in the northern Urals, those choices are not matters of comfort. They are survival decisions. But the Dyatlov tent did not present the searchers with a normal departure. Inside were equipment, food, shoes, outer clothing, personal belongings, and diaries. The record also describes blankets, backpacks, storm jackets, trousers, and other items still in place. These were not decorative details. They were the things a person would need most urgently if leaving a shelter in temperatures described in the case file as about -25 to -30 degrees Celsius, with strong wind. They were the barrier between a human body and the mountain. The contradiction was immediate and physical. The shelters stood on the slope. The necessities remained inside. The people were gone. That contradiction is easy to flatten into mystery, but in the archive it is more precise than that. The tent did not merely contain abandoned property. It contained the practical system of a winter trek. Backpacks were not only bags, they were the organized means by which the party carried food, clothing, tools, and the small necessities of travel. Shoes were not only personal items. On a frozen slope, they were the difference between controlled movement and injury, between endurance and rapid exposure. Outer clothing, storm jackets, and trousers were not optional layers. They were insulation against wind, cold, and snow. Blankets were not domestic comforts. They were part of the camp's protection once the group stopped moving. And the food mattered in a different way. Food remaining in the tent meant the departure was not part of an orderly continuation of the route. The group had already built a labaz earlier, leaving food and equipment that were not needed for the immediate ascent. What remained with the tent should have been the working supply for the people who continued. To walk away from that supply in extreme cold was to step away from the organized plan of the expedition. The diaries mattered too, because they joined the material scene to the human one. The Dyatlov group had not vanished as anonymous figures. They were students and graduates connected to the Ural Polytechnic Institute, traveling a planned Category 3 ski route through the northern Urals. They had names, habits, notes, and a record of movement. Diaries left in the tent placed their ordinary presence inside the shelter until very near the end. The documents stayed where the people should have been. This is why the tent became more than an object found during a search. It became a witness of absence. It had the strange quality of a room interrupted. Not a room in a house, but the mountain equivalent. Canvas, packs, clothing, bedding, food, private things, the arranged materials of people who expected to live through the night and continue the trek. The tent was the place where the group's planning, training, and equipment converged. The official file had described the hikers as sufficiently trained and equipped for the route. Their equipment was still there. Their training had brought them to a camp in harsh conditions. Yet the state of the tent showed that something had driven them away from the very items that made their survival possible. The discovery also began to separate what could be said from what could only be imagined. The scene was alarming, but it did not by itself identify an attacker, a mechanism, or a complete sequence. The searchers had found a shelter with essential belongings inside. They had not yet recovered the full pattern of bodies. They had not yet assembled the later forensic picture of exposure deaths and traumatic injuries. They had not yet reached the full evidentiary argument that would carry through the investigation and then through later reviews. At this point in the record, the tent gave them a question before it gave them a theory. Why would experienced winter hikers leave shelter without shoes, without adequate outer clothing, without storm protection, without the equipment and food that remained within reach? The answer had to be something powerful enough to overcome every ordinary instinct of mountain survival. That does not mean the answer had to be criminal. It means the scene forced investigators to consider urgency. A voluntary walk away from a functioning tent in those conditions is difficult to reconcile with the contents left behind. A planned relocation is equally difficult to reconcile with the absence of essential clothing and footwear. The record points instead toward a sudden break in normal decision-making, a moment when staying inside or leaving through the ordinary routines of camp life was no longer treated as safe or possible. The tent's position made this sharper. It was not in a protected forest hollow. It was on the exposed eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, roughly 10 kilometers in a straight line from Mount Otorten. The group had not only left shelter, they had left shelter on a mountainside where wind and low temperature had already shaped their final camp. The mountain was not background. It was part of the scene. Open slope, snow, darkness, cold, and the materials of survival left behind under canvas. The food, the shoes, the outer clothing, the personal belongings, the blankets, the backpacks, the storm jackets, the trousers, and the diaries all say the same thing in different forms. The departure was not normal. The group did not leave as hikers preparing to travel. They left as people responding to something more immediate than preparation. That is the quiet force of the February 26th discovery. It does not require exaggeration. It does not require invented voices in the dark. It asks only that we look at what was found and what was missing. Inside the tent, the equipment needed to remain alive. Outside the tent, the absence of the 9 people who needed it. From that point forward, the investigation had to follow the contradiction outward, from canvas to snow, from belongings to tracks, from the security of a camp to the exposed descent away from it. But before the footprints could be understood, and before the bodies could give the file its darkest evidence, the tent itself had one more fact to offer. It was not only abandoned. The canvas showed the manner of escape, and that detail would make the problem even narrower. The tent did not only preserve absence, it preserved direction. When searchers reached the camp on February 26, 1959, they found the shelter still holding the ordinary tools of survival: clothing, shoes, food, equipment, personal belongings, diaries. That fact made the abandonment difficult to explain. But the canvas itself added something more specific. According to the case file, the tent had been cut from the inside in 2 places on the lee side. Those cuts allowed people to get out. It is a small phrase in the archive, but it carries great weight. Cut from the inside. Not merely torn by wind. Not described as open from the outside. Not recorded as damage made during the search in order to enter. The investigative record places the cutting action inside the shelter, where the hikers had been. In a case crowded by later interpretations, this is one of the physical details that remains central because it does not require a witness. It is a mark left in the material itself. The tent was the group's last enclosed space. On the eastern slope of height 1079, Kholat Syakhl, in conditions the case file described as about -25 to -30 degrees Celsius, with strong wind, canvas was not a convenience. It was the line between organized survival and exposure. The people inside had pitched it on snow, on an open slope, with enough equipment and clothing to continue the route if conditions allowed. They were trained for a Category 3 ski trek. Their belongings were not scattered as if the camp had been looted. The records do not describe signs of a fight inside the shelter. The official resolution states that no signs of struggle and no traces of other people were found in or near the tent. That is what gives the cuts their importance. They are evidence of action, but not evidence of an attacker. They show that someone inside the shelter made openings through the canvas. They suggest urgency, because cutting a tent is not the ordinary way to leave it. A tent has an entrance. In cold conditions, on a winter route, the fabric is protective equipment. To damage it is to reduce the chance of returning to shelter in usable form. Yet the cuts were there, and the case file says they were on the lee side, the side sheltered from the wind. The word lee matters. In mountain weather, wind direction is not just a detail of atmosphere. It affects where snow collects, how people move, how a shelter is loaded, and what side of an object offers some protection. The file's description does not, by itself, tell us why the hikers cut that side. It does not let us hear what they heard, see what they saw, or know what they believed was happening. But it does locate the exit in relation to wind. The cuts were not recorded as random damage across the tent. They were identified in places that allowed people to escape from within the shelter. A careful reading has to stop there for a moment. The record permits a conclusion about direction and a conclusion about urgency. It does not permit a complete reconstruction of motive. The cuts do not prove panic in the theatrical sense. They do not prove a human enemy. They do not prove a single sequence of commands inside the tent. They tell us that the normal entrance was not, for whatever reason, the route used by those leaving. They tell us that fabric was cut from within, and that the people who left through or by those cuts went out into lethal cold without the equipment still lying inside. This is why the tent has always stood at the center of the Dyatlov file. It is both shelter and scene. It contains the goods of a planned expedition, but its damaged wall records an unplanned departure. The contradiction is physical. A prepared group reaches a slope, digs into the snow, installs a tent, brings its rope materials inside, and then abandons that tent so quickly that many survival items remain. The cuts make that departure more immediate. They narrow the field away from slow, orderly dismantling. They point toward a moment when leaving through the usual opening was not treated as the best available option. But the same record also narrows the field in the other direction. If this were only a story of fear, almost any cause could be imagined. Archive work resists that. Investigators did not record traces of other people in or near the tent. They did not record signs of struggle. The belongings remained. There is no supported basis in the preserved facts we are using here for placing an unknown group inside the camp. The tent may look, at first glance, like a crime scene because of its damage and abandonment, but the file's negative evidence is part of the evidence too. No signs of a fight, no traces of outsiders, no recorded theft, no recorded intruding footprints around the shelter. Negative evidence can be frustrating because it does not narrate. It does not say what happened. It removes possibilities without giving a replacement. In this case, it prevents the simplest sensational answer from resting on the file. The damaged canvas is dramatic, but the surrounding scene does not support a struggle with another party. That leaves a quieter and more difficult question. What condition inside or around the tent could make trained hikers cut their way out from the inside, leave essential clothing and shoes behind, and descend into the cold? The later natural explanations, including avalanche and snow slab reviews, begin from this kind of narrowing. They do not require the tent cuts to be mysterious symbols. They treat them as emergency behavior inside a threatened shelter. The 2020 prosecutorial review prioritized natural explanations, including avalanche, snow slab, and hurricane-force snowstorm. The later scientific work argued that a small slab avalanche could be physically plausible under certain conditions: a snow cut for the tent, irregular terrain, a buried weak layer, and strong katabatic winds depositing wind-blown snow. Those later studies do not erase uncertainty, and this chapter cannot turn them into a finished film of the night. But they show why the cuts matter to a weather-driven reading. If the danger was perceived as pressing against or above the shelter, escape through the canvas may have seemed faster than moving through the normal entrance. Still, we should be careful with the word "if." The case file does not preserve the moment of decision. It preserves the consequences of that decision. 2 cuts from the inside. A tent left with survival equipment inside. No recorded signs of struggle. No recorded traces of other people. The evidence does not solve the case alone, but it sets boundaries around honest explanation. Inside the tent, there may have been confusion, darkness, pressure, sound, cold, wind, and the cramped disorder of people waking or reacting in winter clothing and blankets. The archive cannot confirm those sensations. What it can confirm is the material result. The shelter was breached from within. That is enough to show that the first movement in the fatal sequence was not a normal departure. It was an emergency exit from the group's last protection. The lee side cuts also complicate the idea of return. If the tent had remained fully usable, a later attempt to go back might have meant recovering boots, coats, and equipment. But a cut shelter on an exposed slope, in strong wind and severe cold, was no longer the same refuge it had been when pitched. The hikers may still have understood the value of what was inside. The later positions of some bodies would be interpreted by the investigator as an attempted return toward the tent. But at the moment of exit, the group left the objects that would have given them the best chance to survive outside. The cuts mark that dividing line. The archive therefore asks us to hold 2 things together. The exit appears urgent. The scene does not show a fight with outsiders. That combination is less spectacular than many later stories, but it is more demanding. It points toward an internal response to an immediate perceived threat, under severe environmental conditions, without allowing the record to say more than it knows. From the canvas, the investigation moved outward. The question became not only how they left, but how they moved once they were outside. The snow below the tent held the next layer of evidence, a line of human passage away from shelter, 8 or 9 pairs of tracks entering the cold. From the canvas, the investigation moved into the snow. The tent had already narrowed the problem, an exit from inside, through cuts in the lee side, with survival equipment still left behind. But the slope below the tent added another kind of record. It did not explain why the 9 hikers left. It showed that, after leaving, they did not scatter immediately into chaos. Investigators recorded 8 or 9 pairs of footprints leading away from the tent. That phrasing matters. It is not a clean, modern diagram. It is not a preserved laboratory surface. The searchers were working weeks after the night of February 1st to 2nd, 1959, in winter conditions on the eastern slope of height 1079, Kholat Syakhl. Snow had fallen, wind had worked over the surface, and the scene was not frozen in perfect detail. The record, therefore, does not give us a complete film of movement. It gives us a partial but important trace, a line of human passage, preserved long enough for investigators to describe it. The footprints led away from the tent. In an ordinary emergency at a winter camp, that direction would be difficult enough to understand. The shelter was the place where food, clothing, blankets, backpacks, storm jackets, trousers, shoes, and personal belongings remained. The tent was imperfect, but it was the group's immediate protection against the weather on the slope. The case file had already placed the camp in severe conditions, with temperatures around -25 to -30 degrees Celsius and strong wind. Outside that canvas, every missing layer mattered. Every step away from the tent increased exposure. Yet the footprints did not point toward a quick regrouping at the entrance, or a short search around the camp, or a confused ring of movement close to the shelter. They pointed downhill, away from it. The investigators noted that some of the footprints showed bare or socked feet. Others showed felt boot or soft footwear impressions. This is one of the most human details in the archive, because it brings the scene down from mystery to contact, foot against snow. It tells us that not everyone left the tent in the same state of readiness. Some had footwear of a kind. Some did not have proper protection. Some impressions suggested felt boots or soft footwear, while others suggested bare feet or feet covered only by socks. Those differences fit with what had been found inside the tent. Shoes and outer clothing remained there. The group did not simply pack up and depart. They did not move out as a properly equipped ski party, resuming a route toward Mount Otorten, or returning toward the Ospia River, or making an organized daylight correction after bad navigation. The tracks belonged to people who had left suddenly and incompletely dressed for the conditions. But the same footprints also resist a simple story of panic. The record describes 8 or 9 pairs moving away. It does not describe signs of a fight around the tent. The 1959 resolution states that no signs of struggle and no traces of other people were found in or near the tent. That statement sits beside the footprints like a bracket. On one side, the group leaves its shelter under conditions that make departure dangerous. On the other side, the archive does not support an attacker at the camp. It does not give us unknown tracks crowding the tent. It does not give us evidence of a struggle in the snow around the shelter. It does not give us a separate human presence forcing them down the slope. For a true crime archive report, this is where restraint is most important. The scene looks, at first glance, like the aftermath of violence. A cut tent, abandoned belongings, people missing from shelter, footprints into lethal cold. But the case file does not let the narrator insert another party simply because the departure is frightening. The absence of outside traces is not a solution. It is a boundary. It tells us what the record did not find. And so the contradiction has to remain visible. The hikers appear to have moved away from the only immediate protection they had, while some were barefoot, socked, or wearing only soft footwear. At the same time, investigators did not record the signs that would normally support a forced removal by outsiders. No struggle, no traces of other people in or near the tent. The footprints are therefore not only a path, they are a negative statement. They show movement away from safety, but they do not show the presence of a human enemy driving that movement from the camp. This is why the footprints became one of the central pieces of evidence in the Dyatlov Pass record. They connect the tent to everything that follows. Without them, the abandoned shelter would remain a sealed question. The 9 were inside, and then they were gone. With them, the investigation can say something more limited and more precise. After leaving the tent, the group moved down the slope. The movement was visible in multiple pairs of tracks. The impressions showed varying degrees of protection on the feet. The line of tracks continued for a distance below the tent before disappearing under snow near the forest edge. The research notes preserve that the footprint line was visible for up to 500 meters below the tent. That distance is not the full distance to the forest boundary. It is the portion where the snow still held the evidence clearly enough to be recorded. Beyond that, the mountain took the trail back into weather and accumulation. The investigators could follow the direction, but not every individual step. The archive gives a line, then a loss of line. That loss is important too. It reminds us that this was not an indoor crime scene. The eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl was an exposed winter landscape. Wind, drift, snow depth, and time all shaped what survived in the record. The footprints were not preserved because the mountain wanted to explain itself. They survived unevenly, and investigators had to read them before they disappeared completely. The result is not certainty in the modern forensic sense. It is a field observation made under difficult conditions, and its value lies in what it consistently supports. The group moved away from the tent, and no separate trail of outsiders was identified at the shelter. The number itself, 8 or 9 pairs, has often drawn attention. There were 9 hikers remaining after Yuri Yudin turned back from 2nd Northern because illness prevented him from continuing. The record's wording allows for the imperfect quality of the trace. In wind-affected snow, in a line of people moving over and near one another's impressions, with some wearing soft footwear and some leaving less distinct marks, exact separation would be difficult. The phrase does not prove that one person was absent from the descent. It tells us that investigators saw approximately the number of tracks expected if the group itself had left the tent. That point is easy to miss. The ambiguity of 8 or 9 is not an invitation to invent a missing figure or an extra figure. In the context of the file, it supports the same restrained reading as the rest of the scene. The tracks were consistent with the Dyatlov group moving away. They did not introduce evidence of strangers. They did not show a larger party. They did not show a struggle around the tent before departure. At the same time, they deepened the difficulty of any explanation. If the hikers left under their own power, even under urgent pressure, why did they continue away from shelter in such poor clothing? If they were not being chased by a documented outside force, what made the tent feel less survivable than the open slope? If some were barefoot or in socks, why was there no immediate return for boots, coats, and equipment? These are questions the archive raises. They are not questions it fully answers at this stage. The later natural explanations, including avalanche, snow slab, and hurricane-force snowstorm, considered in the Russian Prosecutor General's Office review announced in 2019, would return to this evidence because the footprints are compatible with a group evacuation rather than a criminal assault. The later avalanche-focused discussion depends in part on the same absence recorded in 1959. No signs of struggle, no traces of other people at the tent. But in this chapter of the evidence, we are not yet at the scientific reconstruction. We are still standing where the investigators stood, looking down from the torn tent into the white slope and following the first visible human record away from it. What the footprints show is movement. What they do not show is motive. They do not tell us whether the hikers expected to return quickly. They do not tell us whether they believed the tent itself had become dangerous. They do not tell us who led, who followed, or whether the group paused together on the slope. They do not tell us how much each person understood in the darkness, wind, and cold. The archive does not permit that kind of certainty. It gives us impressions, bare or socked feet, felt boots or soft footwear, 8 or 9 pairs, leading away. The quiet force of this evidence is that it makes the night physical. It asks us to imagine not a theory, but a sequence of contact with snow. One step, then another. A group of trained hikers, insufficiently dressed for the open cold, moving down from a tent that still held the equipment needed for survival. Behind them, cut canvas, food, shoes, clothing, diaries, and the abandoned structure of camp. Around them, the eastern slope of height 1079, strong wind, and temperatures far below freezing. Ahead of them, the descent toward the forest boundary. The tracks did not continue forever in the record. Snow covered or erased them before they reached the trees. But the direction was enough to shift the investigation outward. The case was no longer only about why the group left the tent. It was now also about what they tried to do after leaving it. At the edge of the forest, the next evidence would no longer be footprints alone. It would be the remains of an effort to survive, a fire in the cold, and the first 2 bodies found near it, about 1,500 meters from the shelter they had left behind. At the edge of the forest, the evidence changed form. The line of footprints from the tent had already shown movement away from shelter, but footprints are a record of passage, not of intention. They do not say what the hikers hoped to do when they reached lower ground. Near the forest boundary, the investigation found something more deliberate. There, about 1,500 meters from the tent on the eastern slope of height 1079, searchers found the remains of a fire. Near that fire were the first two bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivanushenko. This was the point where the archive stopped being only a record of abandonment and became a record of survival behavior. The distance matters. 1,500 meters is not an abstract measurement in this file. It is the space between the tent, still holding shoes, outer clothing, food, blankets, and other equipment, and the forest boundary, where two members of the group were found. It is a descent through winter conditions after a sudden departure from camp. The case file record had already placed the group in severe cold, with temperatures around -25 to -30 degrees Celsius and strong wind when they camped on the slope. The footprints had already shown that some of those leaving the tent were not fully protected for such conditions. Some impressions suggested bare or socked feet. Others suggested felt boots or soft footwear. Against that background, the fire becomes one of the most important human facts in the scene. A fire is not accidental evidence. It requires fuel, ignition, and persistence. It requires someone to stop, gather material, and make heat in a place where heat is disappearing faster than the body can replace it. Near the forest boundary, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivanushenko were found beside the remains of such an effort. The record does not allow us to reconstruct every motion that led to it. It does not tell us exactly who gathered what, who lit it, who stood closest, or who moved away. But it does allow a careful conclusion. After leaving the tent, at least some of the group reached the trees and attempted to create warmth. That attempt sits in contrast with the tent itself. The shelter above them contained the main means of survival. It held equipment, food, clothing, and personal belongings. The group had not walked away from an empty camp. They had walked away from the structure that should have protected them through the night. Whatever forced or persuaded them to leave, the result was that the center of survival shifted downhill from a prepared winter tent to an exposed fire site near the forest boundary. The fire shows adaptation under pressure. It suggests that the descent was not simply a blind flight into darkness. The hikers did not only leave the tent and collapse on the slope. They reached a place where trees or forest edge material could be used. They tried to make heat. In a winter expedition, that decision is understandable. The open slope of Kholat Syakhl offered exposure to wind. The forest boundary offered at least the possibility of fuel and some reduction in wind. Even without adding details not preserved in the file, the logic is clear enough. If the tent could not be used, the forest edge was the next place where survival might still be attempted. But the distance also tells against that hope. 1,500 meters from the tent, the fire was both a sign of resourcefulness and a sign of separation. The group's most important supplies remained uphill. The fire could provide immediate warmth, but it could not replace boots, storm clothing, blankets, and the organized protection of camp. In lethal cold, a fire is not simply comfort. It is a temporary defense. It must be maintained. It must be fed. It protects only those close enough to benefit from it. It does not remove the danger of exposure, especially for people who have already traveled through snow and wind without full winter equipment. The later forensic material would attribute the deaths of Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivanushenko primarily to low-temperature exposure. That finding belongs to the larger pattern recorded in the investigation. Several members of the group died from cold, while others were later found with severe traumatic injuries. For Doroshenko and Krivanushenko, the first bodies located near the fire, the immediate lesson is stark. The attempt to survive was real. It was also insufficient. Their names had appeared earlier in the expedition as part of a trained ski trekking group from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They were not outsiders to winter travel. The official case file described the hikers as sufficiently trained for the Category 3 route and equipped with necessary food and gear. That matters because the fire should not be read as the act of people who did not understand cold. It was more likely the act of people who did understand it and who knew that without heat, the margin for survival would rapidly close. This is one reason the Dyatlov Pass record has remained so difficult. The evidence often points in two directions at once. The tent suggests urgency because it was cut from the inside and abandoned with essential items still present. The footprints suggest organized descent because they moved away without signs of struggle or traces of other people near the tent. The fire suggests survival behavior because it required purposeful action at the forest boundary. Yet the bodies near that fire show that the survival behavior did not succeed. There is no need to make the scene more dramatic than the file already makes it. 2 men were found near the remains of a fire, about 1,500 meters from the tent. That single sentence contains the weight of the situation. It gives the distance from safety. It gives the attempt at heat. It gives the failure of that attempt. It also marks a shift in the investigation's geography. Until this point, the central evidence had been above: the tent, the cuts, the belongings, the tracks. Now the focus moved downhill into the tree line, where the group's actions after leaving the tent had to be read from scattered bodies and limited physical traces. The fire site also raises a restrained question about group movement. The footprints recorded by investigators led away from the tent, but the record does not preserve an unbroken account all the way to the forest boundary. Snow covered or erased the tracks before they reached the trees. By the time investigators considered the bodies near the fire, they were no longer following a simple line of impressions in the snow. They were interpreting positions: the tent above, the fire below, and human remains distributed between those points. That distribution would become one of the most human and painful parts of the case. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko were at the fire. Igor Dyatlov, Rustem Slobodin, and Zinaida Kolmogorova were not found there. They were found on a line between the fire area and the tent, in positions later interpreted by the investigator as an attempted return toward the shelter. That interpretation does not require invention. It arises from placement. Bodies aligned between the lower fire site and the abandoned tent above. Seen from the fire, the tent was not just the place they had left. It was the place where equipment remained. It was the place where shoes, clothing, and other survival materials had been left behind. If any members of the group believed return was possible, the direction would have been obvious: uphill, across the exposed slope, back toward the cut canvas on height 1079. But the archive shows the cost of that distance. The fire at the forest boundary was a temporary answer to the cold. The tent was the fuller answer, but it was 1,500 meters away, uphill, in wind, in darkness, and under conditions already severe enough to make ordinary movement dangerous. Between those 2 points, the next bodies formed a line of effort, as if the case itself were measuring the distance between survival and impossibility. Between the lower fire site and the abandoned tent above, the investigation found a second kind of evidence. It was not a tool, not a cut in canvas, not a footprint preserved in the snow. It was the position of 3 bodies on the slope: Igor Dyatlov, Rustem Slobodin, and Zinaida Kolmogorova. Their locations are among the most quietly devastating details in the Dyatlov record. They do not solve the case. They do not explain why the tent was abandoned. They do not identify the immediate force that drove 9 trained hikers into the cold. But they show something that feels unmistakably human. After reaching the forest boundary, after fire had been attempted near the trees, some members of the group appear to have tried to go back. The official resolution described Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova as lying on a line between the fire area and the tent. That line mattered to the investigator because it gave direction to their final movements. They were not found randomly distributed across the slope. They were not clustered at the fire, and they were not back inside the tent. They occupied the space between the 2 survival points: the temporary shelter of the forest edge below and the abandoned equipment above. According to the case materials, Igor Dyatlov was found about 300 meters from the fire toward the tent. Rustem Slobodin was found about 180 meters beyond Dyatlov. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found about 150 meters beyond Slobodin. Read as a sequence, their positions formed a broken ascent from the cedar area back toward height 1079. The word "toward" is important here. The archive does not preserve their thoughts. It does not tell us what each person knew at that moment, or whether the 3 moved together, separated gradually, or set out at different times. It does not tell us whether they could still see the tent, whether the weather allowed any clear view uphill, or whether they were navigating by memory across a dark, exposed slope. What the record does allow is more limited, but still powerful. The bodies were found in positions interpreted by the investigator as an attempted return toward the tent. In the structure of the case, that interpretation makes practical sense. The fire near the forest boundary could offer heat, but only temporarily. It could not replace boots, outer clothing, blankets, storm jackets, or other equipment left in the tent. The tent contained the materials needed to survive a winter night on Kholat Syakhl. It held shoes, clothing, food, backpacks, and personal belongings. Whatever caused the group to leave, the later logic of survival pointed back uphill. But logic and possibility were not the same thing. The distance from the fire area to the tent was about 1,500 meters. That distance had already been crossed once downhill, away from the tent, under severe conditions. Returning meant climbing back across open ground, toward the slope, in cold and wind, with the group already deprived of normal winter protection. The earlier record places the camp in temperatures of about -25 to -30 degrees Celsius, with strong wind. Under those conditions, exposed skin, inadequate footwear, and exhaustion were not background details. They were active forces. This is why the line of Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova carries such weight. It turns the scene from a puzzle into a sequence of human decisions under pressure. At the tent, something had forced an urgent exit from within. On the slope, tracks had shown movement away from shelter without evidence of a fight or another party. At the forest edge, fire had shown an attempt to survive. And between the fire and the tent, these three positions suggested the next decision, to try to recover what had been left behind. Igor Dyatlov's presence on that line is especially stark because he was the leader of the group. The case file and the expedition materials identify the party by his name, not because he was the only capable member, but because he organized and led the trek. By the time searchers found him, his role had become part of the geography of the scene. He lay not at the tent and not at the fire, but in the space between them, as if the route itself had stopped him. Rustem Slobodin lay farther uphill, beyond Dyatlov. Zinaida Kolmogorova lay farther still. Their positions do not prove who left first, who lasted longest, or who made what decision. They do show that more than one person moved into that exposed middle ground. The line was not a single failed attempt by one hiker. It was a pattern involving three members of the group. For an archive report, the restraint is important. Later retellings often turn this part of the case into drama beyond the evidence, a chase, a hidden pursuer, a final heroic dash described as if witnessed. The investigation did not establish that. The notes available to us do not require an attacker to explain why a return would be attempted. They require only the conditions already present in the record: a tent abandoned in emergency, essential equipment left behind, a fire below that could not solve the problem for long, and a lethal climb back to shelter. The tragedy is that the correct destination may have been unreachable by the time the decision was made. The tent was the rational objective because it contained the means of survival. But it was also uphill, distant, and exposed. If the hikers were underdressed, if some had only socks or soft footwear, if wind and cold continued through the night, then each meter back toward the tent would have taken more than willpower. It would have demanded heat, strength, and coordination that the group may no longer have had. The physical record narrows into that contradiction. The three bodies point toward the tent, but none reaches it. Their line is evidence of intention without completion. It shows action, not rescue. It suggests that at least some of the hikers understood what had to be recovered, yet could not overcome the cold and distance separating them from it. There is something deeply ordinary in that, and therefore more painful than the more elaborate versions of the story. In a survival emergency, people often try to correct the first loss. If shelter is lost, they seek shelter. If clothing is missing, they try to retrieve it. If a fire is insufficient, they look for the supplies that can make survival last longer than a few minutes or an hour. The Dyatlov record, at this point, reads less like a riddle and more like a record of those ordinary instincts failing against extraordinary conditions. The line back toward the tent also helps organize the wider scene. The group was no longer a single cluster. 2 bodies had been found near the fire. 3 were found between the fire and the tent. The remaining 4 were elsewhere, not visible in the first recovery, and not found until much later, under deep snow near the 4th tributary of the Lozva. The distribution suggests that after the group left the tent and reached lower ground, their survival efforts may have divided by necessity. Some remained with the fire. Some attempted the return. Others ended up in the Ravine area, where the record would become still more difficult. For Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova, the archive gives us a final direction rather than a final explanation. They were oriented back toward the abandoned shelter on height 1079. They lay along the path between temporary warmth and the equipment that might have mattered most. That line does not need embellishment. It is one of the clearest human elements in the case, the attempt to go back and the impossibility of getting there. Below that line, near the forest and beyond the fire, the investigation would eventually uncover another part of the scene. It would take until May 4th, 1959, for the last 4 members of the group to emerge from beneath 4 to 4.5 meters of snow. Their location and their injuries would change the tone of the file again. Below the line formed by Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova, the search entered a different season and a different layer of the mountain. The first discoveries in February had come from the slope, the forest edge, and the ground around the cedar and the fire. They were terrible, but they were visible once searchers reached the right places. The last 4 were not visible. They were buried under a depth of snow that turned the investigation from a search across terrain into an excavation. On May 4th, 1959, the bodies of Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault Brignol, and Alexander Kolevatov were found near the 4th tributary of the Lozva. The location was below the fire area, in the ravine zone, about 75 meters from the place where Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko had been discovered near the remains of the fire. By then, the case had already established a rough geography of the group's final movements: the abandoned tent on the eastern slope of height 1079, the footprints leading down, the fire at the forest boundary, the bodies on a line back toward the tent. The ravine added the final point on that map, but it did more than complete the map. It changed the medical character of the file. The 4 were found under approximately 4 to 4.5 meters of snow. That depth matters. It meant the scene had been sealed and altered by winter accumulation, meltwater, and time. The bodies found earlier had been exposed differently to wind, snow, and cold. The last 4 were in a buried ravine environment, close to water and under heavy snowpack. The archive does not allow us to turn that setting into a detailed sequence of every movement they made. It does allow us to say that this was no longer simply the open slope or the forest boundary. It was a place where terrain, snow, and water could preserve some evidence while damaging or obscuring other parts of it. The forensic notes make an important distinction. The 1959 medical material attributed the deaths of Igor Dyatlov, Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Krivonishenko, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Alexander Kolevatov primarily to low-temperature exposure. In plain language, those deaths were understood principally as deaths from cold. That finding fits much of what the earlier scene had already suggested. People outside in severe winter conditions, many without full clothing or proper footwear, separated from the equipment that remained in the tent. But the same forensic record did not treat every death in the same way. Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Nikolai Thibault Brignol had severe traumatic injuries. The distinction is central to the case because it is one of the reasons the Dyatlov file has never felt simple. Exposure can explain the deaths of people trapped outside in the northern Urals in winter. Severe trauma asks a second question: what force produced it? Dubinina's autopsy is among the most cited and most difficult parts of the record. It recorded multiple bilateral rib fractures, meaning fractures on both sides of the chest. The specific injuries included fractures of the right 2nd through 5th ribs and the left 2nd through 7th ribs. The report also recorded internal bleeding, including hemorrhage into the chest cavity. These are not minor injuries. They indicate substantial force applied to the body. Zolotaryov's injuries also involved the chest. His autopsy recorded fractures of the right 2nd through 6th ribs along peristernal and mid-axillary lines. Again, the language is clinical, but the implication is clear. This was significant blunt trauma to the rib cage. Thibault Brignol's injuries were different in location, but similar in seriousness. The case file described a crushed skull fracture, with a fracture area measured as 3 by 7 centimeters and a bone defect measured as 3 by 2 centimeters. Written out as a medical observation, it is cold and precise. Heard as part of the story, it is one of the details that makes the ravine feel separate from the rest of the scene. Kolovatov stands differently in that same group. He was found with the last four in the same buried ravine area, but the forensic material attributed his death primarily to low-temperature exposure. That matters because location alone did not determine the medical conclusion. The last four were found together, but the archive separated the causes and contributing conditions with more care than many retellings allow. One of them was classified with the exposure deaths. 3 were marked by severe trauma. That distinction is where restraint becomes important. The injuries are real in the record. They do not need to be softened. But they also should not be forced into a story unsupported by the file. The 1959 investigation stated elsewhere that no signs of struggle and no traces of other people were found in or near the tent. The evidence at the tent, the footprint line, and the absence of a criminal scene remain part of the same record as the severe injuries. The archive therefore gives us 2 facts that sit uneasily together: no established attacker and serious traumatic damage in 3 of the bodies. The ravine setting is one reason later natural explanations paid close attention to snow mechanics and terrain. A buried body under 4 or more meters of snow is not in the same evidentiary environment as a body lying on an exposed slope. Snow can load, move, collapse, and conceal. Ravines and tributary channels can create pockets where accumulation becomes deeper than on surrounding ground. The research notes for the wider case later returned to avalanche and snow slab mechanisms on the upper slope, but at this point in the original file, the ravine already showed that the mountain itself had not been a passive background. Snow was a material force in the scene. There is another detail in Dubinina's autopsy that has often been repeated without the caution the report itself provides. The autopsy described facial soft tissue loss and wrinkling of the extremities. These details have been used in sensational accounts as if they were signs of deliberate mutilation. The forensic description in the research notes gives a different and more grounded reading. The facial soft tissue loss and the wrinkling of the extremities were described as post-mortem changes associated with decomposition and water exposure. That phrase, post-mortem changes, is essential. It means changes after death. It does not make the injuries less disturbing, and it does not erase the violence of the chest trauma recorded in the same autopsy. But it separates what happened to the body after death from what caused or contributed to death. In a ravine environment, under deep snow, near a tributary, with time passing from early February to May 4th, decomposition and water exposure become part of the physical record. The archive asks us to keep those categories apart. This is one of the places where the case has often been pulled away from its documents. A missing detail becomes a weapon. A medical phrase becomes a rumor. A post-mortem change becomes, in retelling, an act done by a person. But the file is more careful than that. It records both trauma and environmental alteration. It allows the chest injuries and skull injury to remain serious. It also identifies the facial soft tissue loss and wrinkling as changes connected to decomposition and water exposure after death. The discovery on May 4th also closed the human inventory of the search. All 9 members who had continued from 2nd Northern had now been found. The record no longer concerned a missing group. It concerned a completed death scene spread across a slope, a forest boundary, a return line, and a ravine. Each zone had its own evidence: the cut tent and abandoned equipment above, the footprints descending from height 1079, the fire near the cedar, the 3 bodies oriented back toward shelter, and finally, the 4 under deep snow near the 4th tributary of the Lozva. The ravine is therefore not just the place where the last bodies were found. It is the place where the case becomes hardest to hold in a single explanation. Exposure remains central. Severe trauma enters with force. Post-mortem environmental changes complicate what the bodies looked like when found. Snow, terrain, cold, and time all press into the file. By late May, the investigators had to convert that difficult record into an official conclusion. They had to account for the abandoned tent, the lack of signs of struggle, the absence of traces of other people, the exposure deaths, and the severe injuries found in the ravine. The phrase they chose would become one of the most quoted lines in the entire case: an overwhelming force. It closed the criminal file, but it did not close the argument. By late May, the investigation had reached the point where the mountain evidence had to become legal language. The search had moved from the tent on the eastern slope of Height 1079 to the tracks descending toward the forest, to the fire at the boundary of the trees, to the line of 3 bodies pointed back toward shelter, and finally to the ravine where the last 4 were found under 4 to 4.5 meters of snow. Each location added something. None of them produced the thing a criminal case most needed, a criminal scene. On May 28, 1959, the criminal case was terminated. The conclusion was brief, but its afterlife would be long. The deaths, the resolution said, were caused by an overwhelming force. It also found that there was no corpus delicti. That phrase, corpus delicti, is legal language. In this context, it meant the investigators did not establish the elements of a crime. There was a tragedy. There were 9 dead people. There was a tent cut open from the inside. There were bodies in separate places, some without adequate clothing for the conditions, and some with injuries that remained disturbing on the page. But the file did not identify an attacker, did not document evidence of a fight, and did not preserve traces of other people in or near the tent. The official conclusion did not say the scene was ordinary. It said the scene did not support a criminal charge. That distinction is one of the reasons the Dyatlov case has remained so difficult to discuss clearly. A non-criminal conclusion is not the same thing as a simple explanation. The investigators were not saying that everything was fully understood in a way that removed all questions. They were saying that, under the evidence they had gathered, the case did not contain proof of a crime. The wording closed the file procedurally. It did not close every uncertainty produced by the mountain. The official resolution emphasized the absence of signs of struggle. This detail matters because so much of the case can feel, at first glance, like the aftermath of violence. The group left the tent without the clothing and shoes that would normally be necessary for survival. Equipment, food, personal belongings, and diaries remained inside. The tent had been cut from the inside in 2 places on the lee side. 8 to 9 pairs of footprints led away from the shelter, some made by bare or socked feet, some by felt boots or soft footwear. 2 bodies were found near the remains of a fire about 1,500 meters away. 3 were found between that fire area and the tent in positions interpreted by the investigator as an attempted return. 4 more were found only in May beneath deep snow near the 4th tributary of the Lozva. Taken separately, these details sound like fragments of a criminal mystery. Taken as a case file, they also show something else, a group moving away from the tent together, without recorded evidence of an outside party forcing them down the slope. That is the weight carried by the line, about no traces of other people. It is not a dramatic sentence, but it is one of the strongest anchors in the original investigation. If there had been another group at the tent, if there had been a fight, if outsiders had come and gone in a way that left marks in the snow or signs in the camp, that would have changed the case. The investigators recorded the opposite. In or near the tent, they did not find signs of struggle, and they did not find traces of other people. This does not make the later questions disappear. It makes them narrower. The question becomes not, who attacked them, but what event could make experienced winter hikers leave a shelter in lethal weather without the equipment needed to survive? That is a different kind of question. It is less theatrical, but it is more faithful to the file. The words overwhelming force were broad enough to hold more than one possibility. They did not name an avalanche. They did not name a slab. They did not name a hurricane-force snowstorm. They did not describe a single sequence beginning at the tent and ending in the ravine. They pointed towards something beyond the group's control, something powerful enough to defeat training, planning, and ordinary expedition judgment. But because the phrase was not specific, it left a space into which decades of speculation could enter. That space grew around the hardest contradictions. The hikers were described in the 1959 case file as sufficiently trained for a Category 3 difficulty trek and as having necessary equipment and food. They were not beginners wandering accidentally into winter. They had planned a route through the northern Urals. They had managed supplies, including the Lebaz and the upper Auspia River area. They had adapted to weather and terrain before reaching the final camp. The official record therefore had to hold 2 truths at once. The group was competent, and the group still died after abandoning its tent. The deaths also resisted a single emotional category. Some of the forensic material attributed death primarily to low-temperature exposure. Dyatlov, Doroshenko, Krivonyshenko, Kolmogorova, and Kolevatov belong in that part of the record. Their deaths speak to cold, distance, exhaustion, and the failure of return. But Dubinina, Zolotaryov, and Thibaut Brignol had severe traumatic injuries. Dubinina's autopsy recorded multiple bilateral rib fractures and internal bleeding. Zolotaryov had rib fractures. Thibaut Brignol had a serious skull injury. Those injuries changed the feel of the file, even when the investigation did not treat them as proof of an assailant. Here again, the official conclusion is both firm and incomplete. It denies a criminal basis. It does not fully reconstruct the physical event that produced every injury, every movement, every decision. The result is a sentence that functions almost like a sealed door with a gap beneath it. The file is closed, but air continues to move through. In later retellings, overwhelming force would often be treated as if it were an admission of mystery. In a stricter archive reading, it is also an admission of limitation. The investigators could describe what they did and did not find. They could state that the tent had been cut from inside. They could record the footprints leading away. They could document the absence of struggle and other traces. They could describe the bodies and the medical findings. But they did not have, in May of 1959, the kind of physical model that would later be proposed for a delayed snow slab release, wind loading, terrain steps, and a buried weak layer. So the original phrase remained general. It had to cover the force that drove the group from the tent, the cold that killed several of them, and the conditions that left others beneath meters of snow in the ravine. It had to do this without inventing an attacker the evidence did not support. That restraint is important. The absence of a criminal scene is not a minor footnote. It is one of the central facts of the case. It does not answer every question, but it tells us which answers require evidence the file did not contain. A theory involving outsiders must explain why the official investigation recorded no signs of struggle and no traces of other people in or near the tent. A theory involving internal violence must confront the same absence of struggle at the camp and the footprint evidence of movement away from the shelter. The record may be strange, but strangeness is not itself proof of murder. The phrase overwhelming force therefore sits at the center of the Dyatlov case for two opposite reasons. It is vague enough to invite doubt and concrete enough to mark the direction of the official judgment. It says that the fatal cause was not established as a human crime. It also says that whatever happened was powerful enough to overcome 9 trained hikers in severe mountain conditions. In that sense, the 1959 conclusion is not just an ending. It is a boundary. On one side of it is the criminal investigation, the tent, the tracks, the bodies, the autopsies, and the legal decision that there was no corpus delicti. On the other side is the long scientific and public argument over what kind of natural force could fit those facts. For decades, that argument would circle the same scene, the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, the snow cut for the tent, the strong wind, the cold, the buried terrain, the descent toward the forest, and the ravine under deep snow. Eventually, official reviewers and researchers would return to the phrase, not as a dead end, but as a clue. If the killer left no fingerprints, perhaps the record had been pointing from the beginning towards something harder to see at the time, a weather-driven mechanism written into the slope before the hikers could know it was there. That phrase, an overwhelming force, survived because it was both specific and unfinished. It ruled out a prosecutable crime, but it did not name the mechanism. It did not say exactly what moved through the camp, or what the hikers saw, or why trained people left their shelter without the clothing and footwear that could have kept them alive. It left the file in a strange position, legally closed, physically unresolved. Decades later, when Russian prosecutors returned to the case, they did not reopen it as a murder inquiry. In February 2019, the Russian Prosecutor General's office announced a review that prioritized natural explanations. The versions named publicly were not assassins, escaped prisoners, secret weapons, or a staged scene. They were avalanche, snow slab, and hurricane-force snowstorm. That choice matters. It did not solve every contradiction by itself, but it narrowed the question back toward the mountain. The evidence that had made the case feel so unnatural was still the same evidence. The tent cut from the inside, the tracks leading downhill, the absence of signs of struggle, the lack of traces of other people, the exposure deaths, the severe traumatic injuries, and the deep snow in the ravine. The modern review treated those facts not as clues to an intruder, but as features of a winter environment capable of forcing sudden decisions. On July 11, 2020, TASS reported the conclusion presented by Andrei Kuryakov of the Russian Prosecutor General's office. According to that report, prosecutors concluded that an avalanche killed the Dyatlov group. The word was simple, perhaps too simple for a case that had accumulated decades of competing explanations. But the official direction was clear. The suspected force was natural. It came from snow, wind, slope, and timing. The difficulty has always been that the tent site does not resemble, at first glance, the classic image of a large, destructive avalanche path. This is one reason older objections persisted. The average slope angle near the tent appeared too gentle to many observers. The tent was not found swept far down the mountain. The scene did not present itself as a broad, obvious avalanche disaster. The modern scientific argument responded by making the proposed event smaller, more local, and more dependent on the exact conditions of the camp. In 2021, a paper in Communications, Earth and Environment proposed that a delayed small slab avalanche could have occurred after the hikers cut into the snow to make a platform for the tent. In that model, the snow cut was not a dramatic mistake. It was an ordinary mountaineering action in severe winter conditions, creating a flat place to sleep on a slope. But by cutting the slope, the group may have weakened a snow slab that was already under stress. The paper combined several factors. One was the snow cut made for the tent. Another was irregular terrain under the snow, including local features that could make one part of the slope behave differently from the broader average angle. A third was a buried weak layer, the kind of hidden structure that can allow a slab above it to detach. The fourth was strong katabic wind descending from colder, higher ground, capable of transporting snow and depositing it over the tent area after the camp was already in place. This is where the title of the episode becomes less metaphor and more mechanism. The killer left no fingerprints, only a weather report from next week. Not because anyone literally received such a report, but because the decisive information may have been atmospheric and delayed. The danger was not necessarily visible when the tent was pitched. It could have been written into the slope by wind loading over time. Snow moved from one place to another, weight increasing above the cut, stress building in darkness. A delayed slab release would also explain why a camp could be established in one condition and become dangerous later. The hikers may have had no reason, at the moment of installation, to believe the tent platform would become a trap. They were experienced, and the case file described them as trained and equipped for the route. The hypothesis does not require them to be careless. It requires only that they made a reasonable camp in a place where hidden snow structure, terrain, and wind later combined against them. In this reading, the torn or cut tent is not the sign of panic caused by an attacker. It is the sign of people escaping from within a shelter they believed they could not safely use. The footprints leading away are not the trail of people being marched under threat. They are the record of a descent made in extreme cold, possibly after the tent had been damaged, partially buried, or judged too dangerous to re-enter. The survival behavior at the forest boundary, the fire, and the attempted return toward the tent become part of a sequence shaped by exposure and loss of equipment. The severe injuries found later in the ravine remain among the most difficult parts of the case. The slab avalanche hypothesis has often been evaluated partly on whether a small snow movement could produce trauma without destroying the entire scene. The 2021 paper argued that even a relatively small slab could have been dangerous if it struck people lying inside the tent, especially if their bodies were pressed against hard objects such as skis or packed equipment. The proposal was not that a vast avalanche erased the camp. It was that a compact, dense mass of snow could have delivered enough force to injure, frighten, and displace the group's sense of safety. Then, in 2022, a follow-up in Communications, Earth and Environment added field evidence. That later reporting addressed one of the central objections, whether the slopes near Dyatlov Pass were truly avalanche-prone. Using field observations and terrain analysis, the researchers reported that the area did contain local terrain capable of slab avalanche release. Drone photogrammetry showed terrain steps with inclinations exceeding 28 to 30 degrees, even though the average slope appeared lower. That distinction is important. Avalanches do not respond to the average impression of a mountain from a distance. They respond to local slope, snow layers, wind deposition, and fracture conditions. The 2022 follow-up also reported that slopes near Dyatlov Pass are avalanche-prone, not merely in theory. It cited documented slab avalanches observed on January 29, 2022, by guides Oleg Demyanenko and Dmitry Borisov. Those slab avalanches occurred on an eastern slope less than 3 kilometers from the tent location. That does not prove what happened on the night of February 1st to 2nd, 1959. But it does change the evidentiary landscape. It shows that the nearby terrain can produce the kind of snow slab behavior the modern hypothesis requires. The follow-up also connected the area to broader natural hazard classification. The Russian Natural Hazards Handbook classified the Dyatlov Pass area as Category 2 avalanche risk, meaning at least 1 avalanche per kilometer every 10 years, with January flagged as the most dangerous month. Again, this does not close every gap. It does not give us a film of the night or a final spoken decision inside the tent or a complete minute-by-minute reconstruction of the descent. But it places the Dyatlov camp within a landscape where avalanches were not impossible intrusions into the story. They were part of the mountain's winter vocabulary. That vocabulary was not fully legible in the original criminal case. The investigators in 1959 had the tent, the tracks, the bodies, the autopsies, and the weather as they could reconstruct it. They saw no signs of struggle. They found no traces of other people. They closed the file with an overwhelming natural force. What later reviewers and scientists added was not a new body of criminal evidence, but a more precise language for natural force: slab, weak layer, wind loading, katabatic flow, terrain step, delayed release. Still, a careful ending has to preserve uncertainty. The exact sequence remains debated. Researchers can model snow behavior, compare terrain, analyze wind deposition, and revisit the known record, but the 9 hikers died without leaving a final testimony. No explanation should pretend to know more than the sources allow. The avalanche or snow slab hypothesis is not powerful because it answers every question with theatrical certainty. It is powerful because it asks fewer unsupported things of the evidence. It does not require unknown attackers on a remote slope where investigators found no traces of them. It does not require a staged tent, a fabricated trail, or a hidden criminal scene. It begins with what the archive already held: a tent cut from within, a group leaving into lethal cold, strong wind, very low temperature, a slope altered for camp, deep snow, injuries, and no proven human enemy. In the end, the most source-grounded suspect may not be a person at all. It may be a mechanism that looked ahead of the hikers by only a few hours: wind moving snow through darkness, weight building over a buried weakness, a small slab waiting above a tent cut into the slope. A weather report from next week arriving too early on Kholat Syakhl. No fingerprints, no confession, only the mountain, the snow, and a force that the first investigators could name only in outline.